This is like, having BlackBerry come up on stage right after Apple spoke, talking about private clouds after public clouds came up. So anyway, let me just get started with some round of introductions. Do you want to start, Sai?
Sure. Thank you, Sunil. My name is Sai. I work for T-Mobile. My team focuses on building next-gen data platforms at T-Mobile. So I'm going to be talking about what does it mean in the context of public and private clouds, which is the today's topic. Very delighted to be here with you guys to share my thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, hi. I'm Rahul Tripathi. Glad to be here. I'm responsible for product managing what is called IT operations management software portfolio at HP Enterprise Software. And among other things, we focus a lot on how to build private clouds and what kind of software is required. My background is all stacks of the infrastructure. I had a stint at VMware, and before that was also at Cisco for a long time.
Hi, I'm Banit Agrawal. I work in the Facebook infrastructure team. Before that, I was working at VMware, working on holistic performance of the vSphere hypervisor, as well as on the end-user computing, the VDI products. Before that, I did my PhD from UC Santa Barbara, master's from UC Riverside, and BTech from IIT Kharagpur. So I'll share some of my insights with why private cloud matters, some of my experience working with customers, and some of the experiences.
Hi, my name is Ram Singh. I'm currently working at VMware as Senior Director. Over the last couple of years, I have been involved in the network virtualization effort, one of the key ingredients to building a private cloud. Look forward to a good panel discussion today.
Yeah.
The folks.
Hey, thanks, Ram. Thanks, guys. So let me just jump right in. I think, just to personalize this discussion for the kind of work that Nutanix is doing, but many of my colleagues here are doing as well. We at Nutanix have a simple line that we ask ourselves every day. We are the fastest growing enterprise infrastructure company around in the fastest declining market of all time, which is essentially we sell on-premise enterprise infrastructure when everything's moving to the public cloud, right? So the basic question is, if the apps are moving outside and the users are moving outside, why the hell is your infrastructure still inside? And clearly that may be a 10, 20-year trend, not a 4 or 5-year trend, but secularly that's a major question that we ask ourselves. So when this topic came up, whether the term is private clouds, hybrid clouds, whatever we want to call it, the simplest way we think about it, and I'll use this to set the context, and then we can have a good panel discussion here, is so we think that it's not going to be a zero-sum game 10, 20 years from now, right? And the number one reason why it's not a zero-sum game 10, 20 years from now, even after if you look at Amazon's growth, it's at $10 billion. Azure is at almost $1 billion. If you add up a few other, the second and third and the fourth and so forth, they're all growing pretty rapidly. The biggest difference from our lens is that what we see in the enterprise is the fact that everybody has tasted the Amazon wine. And they want to covet that same experience in-house. And there's some characteristics of the Amazon wine, right? Which is you can start small, start quickly, pay as you grow, great experience. But the reason why we believe it's not a zero-sum game is not because of security, not because of compliance, because they're all at the end of the day temporal measures. Because the moment Amazon lands a data center in Münster, Germany, the fiducia, the large government customer, has no reason not to leverage that particular capability, right? But we'll talk about some practical considerations that are obviously adding more thoughts for, or at least measures of compliance that are actually putting some level of thought into the enterprise adoption of public cloud. But the real secular reason why we think that there's a room for an Amazon-like infrastructure inside the enterprise is cost, especially for predictable workloads. So at a very highest level, and we'll talk through some of this stuff, is we think that we have to use the right cloud for the right workload as long as they're sharing the same architectural principles. And obviously for elastic workloads, it makes total sense to use a public consumption model. For predictable workloads, when you just do the math of a rent versus lease versus buy, it doesn't make too much sense in the long term to use a public consumption model. So those were some of the high-level thoughts that went into the creation of this panel. Obviously, we wanted to hear from a varied set of colleagues here, some from a customer lens, some from an adopter lens, as well as some from a vendor lens, and so forth. So without any further ado, why don't I set it up in 3 kinds of questions for this track. So the first question is obviously, why do we think private clouds will stay over the next 10 to 20 years, not for the first 10 years? So maybe we can start with the 2 adopters of a private cloud, Sai and Banit, right?
Thank you, Sunil. Like the way Sunil was mentioning about the different skill set we have here in the panel, where some of them are focused on the infrastructure, how do we build cloud. I am the consumer of the infrastructure. I focus on how do I leverage a cloud infrastructure from a development perspective for custom applications or BI or data applications. So if I take a step back, before I jump into why we need private cloud, I want to share my thoughts on our journey at T-Mobile, how that got transformed into the usage of public and private clouds that we're talking about today. A few years ago, when I was managing a development team from an application development perspective, the whole concept of cloud, it didn't start with the vision that we need to have 100 servers in a minute, and then we need to be able to scale up and scale down. It really didn't start with the vision, at least in my team. So the idea of adopting a cloud started with the concept that how do I streamline my development processes when I started adding more development teams to cope up with the demand of my business groups. Consistency from a development process perspective. How do I make sure my dev teams can start using same dev environment, QA environment, with templatized versions of SDLC practices. So I kind of read the concept of how do I make sure my dev teams have the flexibility to create environments on demand. That way they follow a consistent process. So very, very basic, this was almost like 6 years ago. Then obviously once we start changing that culture and behavior in terms of we have the flexibility to, and also a way to get there from a standardization of SDLC perspective using these environments, we started looking at usage patterns of various applications. Who is the largest consumer of our application? Started dividing our application catalog into various types, web-based, mobile, or internal-facing applications, or appliance-related products like Teradata, for example, or big data platforms like Hadoop. So when we start really looking at different applications running on different platforms, our criteria of what is the right cloud platform to adopt, it really boils down to what is the application that we are trying to run there, and also what are the use cases and what are the requirements that we need to be ready for to run these applications seamlessly in that infrastructure. So what I mean by that is, let's take T-Mobile.com as an example. Today, T-Mobile.com runs on a public cloud. When you look at our customer growth, every day we add thousands of new customers. So you can imagine the explosive data growth every day flowing into T-Mobile systems, and our ability to manage, in this case, T-Mobile.com website with this demand, and being able to predict that workload, or not able to predict that workload, but have the flexibility to scale up or scale on the infrastructure. We made the decision on the public cloud. At the same time, going back to why do we need private cloud? So as part of this journey over the years, what we learned was there are many things that we need to go through when it comes to choosing a private and public cloud. A few things are security, compliance, regulatory reasons, and total cost of ownership too. Price matters from a budgeting perspective. And also how much customization do we have flexibility when it comes to private and public cloud, and SLA management too. When we run these workloads, how do we manage these workloads too? So these are the categories that we established. In the interest of time, I'm going to let other folks to kind of jump in, and then I'll come back to these topics.
That sounds good, Sai. Banit?
Yeah, thanks. So reiterating over what Sunil said, like cost is one of the primary factor. And again, going back to what Sai said, that the SLA management is also another key benefits that you get with private cloud, right? So I will use Facebook, one of the architecture as an example to illustrate my point. So Jay presented in the morning about Facebook data center. So we are building various data center, and it's one of the largest infrastructure, if you will. And if you look at it, we have done a lot of announcement, not only on the software side, but like on the hardware architecture, right? So that we can drive cost and efficiency in Facebook infrastructure stack, right? So just to start with an example, so if you look at a 60,000 feet overview, Facebook is basically like you have a web server, you are accessing facebook.com, then you have a social graph data store, and then you have your photo and video storage, right? So if you look at and deep dive into the photo and video storage, when you upload a photo or video of a friend or a family, so it's basically stored into one data center and then another data center to basically maintain the reliability, so that in case of crash, we can actually faithfully reproduce or get that particular picture, right? So now, if let's say, and this gets replicated 3.6 times, right? So there is an efficiency, whether we can optimize the efficiency of Facebook photo and video storage, right? So that is one thing that we were looking. So what trend that we noticed that once a photo is uploaded, it's basically hot for a certain time, right? And after some point of time, we see that the access pattern on that particular photo or video dies down, right? Or it slows down. So we can classify this photo and video into two categories, right? One is hot photo and video and another is warm. And then you can have a third category, which is cold storage, which is accessed very few, like very less times, right? So how do we know that, like now that we have built this architecture for photo and video storage with high replication, with high performance requirement, with high reliability and with high scalability requirements, now what we can do with warm storage to reduce the replication? So what we went ahead is, we basically looked at all the hardware architecture, what we can do at the software. We did the co-design with the hardware and the software. So we can drive this, and then we finally able to reduce the replication factor from 3.6 to 2.1. That's a 40% win right there, just by looking at driving and having the control on the full stack, hardware and software. So having this full control on the hardware and software, you can actually drive efficiency, both in terms of the cost, performance, and efficiency.
Yeah, and in fact, just not to interrupt you there, but it's a very important point that we've seen this repeatedly, is one of the reasons that if you look at the adoption of the type of public clouds, there is Amazon and Azure, and then there is another company which many of you know called SoftLayer, which is IBM. And if you really classify why a customer goes to SoftLayer, has a very interesting connotation, right? Which is those customers whose workloads need control on the bare metal and the infrastructure elements up to the full stack prefer an environment like SoftLayer. Whereas if you go to Amazon, obviously there's a certain level of shielding and a certain level of API abstraction that actually happens, and obviously there's a lot of benefits to that for a variety of apps. But one of the core reasons that there's a variant of what we are calling as public clouds is emerging, which is this bare metal commodity public clouds that give you more deeper control over the full stack as a way to support, workloads that Banit was talking about, if you're okay with outsourcing that, or if you're okay with actually having an elastic variant of it.
Yes. So another thing I would like to point out here is that a lot of times also, because when you render a particular page, there are not just like few services, like there are hundreds of services which take in participate together to give you the final rendering page, right? And when there are this hundreds of services, you have to know what is your SLA requirement. Let's say if one of the service fails, right? How do we actually know which of the service fails, right? Or which of the service is the bottleneck, right? So when you're running in the public cloud, you're running on various like shielding, as just Sunil was mentioning. Because you are shielded so much from the hardware, you don't have enough visibility of what's going on. Whether you are multi-tenant on the rack, you're multi-tenant on the server, or you're multi-tenant like you're sharing the top of the rack switch or with some of the edge or router switch, right? So you don't have enough visibility on what's going on in your infrastructure when any of the services that goes bad, or you have to debug that particular service, right? So that's performance troubleshooting also comes into picture when you are doing this at a private or public cloud.
Got it. No, it's good. So maybe Rahul and Ram, you can chime in briefly before we.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think in my mind, the attraction of cloud is primarily two reasons. It's cost and consumption model. cost is because I can just rent it like a rental car. I can just have it for a couple of days and just return it and no questions asked. And it's easy because I can just go through to it with APIs. And that is true across public or private. And then why private is relevant, and one example comes to mind, that this is a large customer we were visiting a while back in Europe. And they are one of the largest customers of Amazon. And basically, they had like an unfettered access. A lot of their sales guys were doing actually demos of their software through Amazon. And before you know it, the sales guy was seeing a bill line item, which was like about 5 to 6% of the sales costs were Amazon. And then one fine day, this guy asked, right, I'm a sales guy, why am I spending that much money in IT infrastructure? So the IT gets a call and say, guys, IT, you guys have to fix it. And then they look at it and say, the reason the cost was high because people were letting the VMs running, there was no governance around it, they were running like it was like free for all. So they said, I'm not needing any special service, I just need a resource to run these VMs, which by the way have to run in on-prem anyway, so I can actually set up a much more efficient infrastructure, and they were able to really have a strategy and really bring down. So example like that. Second is the consumption model. So we ran into a number of customers where the attraction is all about the consumption model. The reason I like cloud is because I can really easily access it versus a plethora of software that I'm subjected to in the on-premise environment. And that is where I think things have started moving forward. For example, in our HPE environment, we bought a company called Yucca or Eucalyptus. Their whole value proposition is how do you layer in an Amazon-like API to access an on-premise environment. So those kind of models have started evolving. So now people are figuring out that both from a cost perspective, it is more attractive for certain class of workloads, as we'll go into later in the discussion. And then secondly, the consumption model issues can also be solved. You can actually have models where you can address infrastructure as code and have the right APIs. So I think with those two things getting solved, I think the puck is now more or less for right reasons, people choose private cloud, and for right reasons, people choose public clouds. So I think it's no longer that debate whether private clouds are relevant, whether they're going to stay or not. I personally believe they're going to be there because for the examples that you just heard, there is no other option but to really have a very optimized infrastructure, which is both hardware, software, and the upper layers of the applications.
So let me ask you a question off script. You ready? So why did HP get rid of their public cloud?
So because we figured out two things. One, building a public cloud is incredibly hard. So just to be honest, right? Because like for Azure, it took them many, many years before they could catch up to Amazon, right? So let's not kid that building a public cloud is easy, number one. Number two is you also realize that it's a race to the bottom from a financial perspective. You have to really make money elsewhere. You are not going to make money in the core infrastructure. So if you are a business-driven company, you don't have amounts of funding and the valuation that will support your growth ad nauseum without making a lot of money, you really come back to basics. And so where I'm going to make money, where the customers want us to spend our energy on. And we came to a conclusion, let's partner with likes of Amazon and Azure and let them do the public cloud. But there's a lot of customer demand in the private cloud space. We can fulfill the need, and that's why we kind of changed the strategy and pulled back and focused on private
Sounds
cloud.
good. Sounds good. Ram, you want to add something?
I think, Sunil, the way you opened it, one of the comments that you earlier on made it, I just want to re-emphasize on that particular point. Day before yesterday, I was sitting with one of the largest car manufacturing company. They said, I have my business critical application that I have optimized for my data center. These are consistent and predictable workload. I know how they are going to grow over time. What I want private cloud for is for simple reason, to have a continuous cost reduction. So that's one. Second, they want to use the private cloud to provide a key differentiation over their competitors. If they have some secret sauce on certain IP, they really want to close it close to their heart and protect it and secure it. But those are the key reason he quoted why he really wanted to go with the private cloud. I think most of the panelists has already covered the cost reason. I just want to add these two other and re-emphasize on consistent and predictable workload, especially those of business critical, are going to run in the private cloud.
Got it. That makes sense. So Sai, maybe when you guys considered, clearly T-Mobile has done a lot on the public cloud side already. You're trying to consider some workloads for the private cloud. And you personally, are you on the application side or in the infrastructure side? By the way, I should have asked you that before this panel, but
That's
I'll
okay.
answer it now.
I'm on the app development side.
You're on the app development side.
Primarily
Yeah?
focused on BI and data applications.
Got it.
So-
So even more relevant for us. So you're not an infrastructure guy.
Nope.
Okay. So why do you care to have a private cloud?
That's a great question. So going back to some of the criteria, the topic that I was mentioning about a few minutes ago, when I look at the way my team chooses whether we need a private cloud or public cloud for any app or any platform that we actually built on our infrastructure, I'm going to go back to the criteria I talked about. It is going to be very specific to the use case. For us, when it comes to customer data, this is a mandate within T-Mobile to kind of go through this process. Well, the first one is data security. Do we need to protect the data? Do we have CPNI, PII, PCI related or other regulatory related requirements we need to go through? Right there, the initial reaction is going to be huge no to public cloud when we get into those scenarios, right? It's not that we cannot do public cloud when we get into these data security scenarios, but the general tendency is more predictive when we go to private cloud. The other thing as part of that evaluation criteria is the other regulatory things like SOX, auditing things that we can have much more control, including the SLA management criteria that we were talking about too. Do we really have control on our hardware to be able to monitor, to be able to enhance the performance if we need to make those decisions? That's also part of the criteria too. And also, primarily kind of focusing on how do I make a decision based on the workloads, whether it's private or public, at a high level, without really going into the details of this is how we make the decision. When it comes to typical web, mobile app-based development aspects, you go with public cloud because it gives you a lot of flexibility to kind of manage your web database servers, being able to scale up or scale down the infrastructure at any time that you want. But when it comes to data-intensive applications, I have huge data sets that I need to process, and then you have all sorts of data jumbled in that core, secure, non-secure data. You don't typically go with public cloud to start with. So that's where you kind of start taking like, I have billions of humongous amounts of data sets that I need to process to visualize or get insights to derive actions for my business leaders. We tend to go with private clouds on our side.
Got it. And what do you anticipate the time frame for a meaningful adoption of a private cloud in T-Mobile?
So I would say we're still in the very early stages to be completely transparent in terms of are we pretty mature from a process and from an adoption perspective. We are still at a very early stages of kind of understanding all the intricacies with the private cloud adoption. I would say specifically in my team, again within T-Mobile you have different teams adopting cloud environments both from a public and private perspective. From my team perspective though, I would say in a year or 1.5 years from now, we should have more maturity model established in terms of, okay, this is where we feel really confident about the way we manage and then the way we get results from the private cloud infrastructure.
Got it. And we'll come back to like the how of the private cloud a little later. So maybe Rahul and Ram, you can speak a little bit about what are you guys seeing as vendor partners to your customer base as to the type of workloads that specifically are more suited, right? Beyond the obvious ones. Yeah.
So in order to understand what kind of applications are being run in the private cloud, so let me start with a concrete example.
Sure.
One of the largest healthcare provider wanted to connect clinics, hospitals, pharmacy, doctors and patient on a single infrastructure. And the kinds of application they want to run is clinical trial results should be shared between clinics and doctors. Doctors should share patient-related treatment information with the patients. And FDA advisory in terms of drugs and all that should be transmitted to the pharmacies. So that's kind of application they are running in that environment. You can see there's a multi-tenancy, there's isolation requirement, there's a security requirement, as well as required agility from private cloud to run these different kinds of workloads, right? If you look underneath the hood, essentially they are looking at 2-tier applications, 3-tier applications, Windows applications, DB applications. So that's one example. I'll take Nova Media as a private cloud provider. They are running lottery services, lottery application on top of the private cloud. And I think most of the people will appreciate this particular example, which is California Department of Water. They build a private cloud where all the natural resource agency, there are almost 28 of those, are actually leveraging single private cloud, and they've significantly reduced their cost. And of course, as a taxpayers, we would definitely want to appreciate those kind of savings by the government agencies. So in general, we can see all the business critical applications people are trying to run in their private cloud environment.
Right, but is it, do you sense though that it's just a matter of convenience? That's because it's the easy thing to do versus the right thing to do?
I think they're looking more from the cost, this is the right thing for them to do.
From a cost perspective?
From the cost perspective, as well as there are certain security, compliance, regulatory requirements that they have to adhere to, right? And over longer term, they see this is much more cost-saving exercise than trying to leverage the public cloud. Public cloud, they do access in scenario where they are running ad hoc applications that come in the way, and they want to really leverage the public cloud for short-term bursting. You're doing some quarterly number crunching or seasonality is happening, and you want to go to the public cloud to leverage that.
Got it. We'll come back to some qualification of that as well. Rahul?
Yeah, so in my experience, working with customers that are leveraging a private cloud, public cloud, all of those, the applications that people are using in private cloud roughly in my mind fall into three categories. One is data intensive applications, which because it's just impractical to have a lot of data to be moved over just to do some application work on it. Just doesn't make sense. So people want to really leverage private cloud, so that I see a lot of it. Second class I see is latency sensitive applications. So anytime any real-time application is required, media rich application, even things like virtual desktops in an environment, where like it's real-time interaction with the user. Oftentimes you're able to tune better performance with your private cloud infrastructure, because you control networking, storage, compute, application layer, you can tweak a lot of things. So I see those class of applications. Third, typically I see is that it's more of a traditional enterprise software applications where like there's a foundation built in and people are using certain templates to develop, and now they're writing additions to those modules. So they still want to add efficiency in the software development process, because these days no software organization wants not to be DevOps kind of organization. Nobody wants to be like, I'll develop in 6 months, test 3 months, and then deliver it to you. So for people trying to drive that hybrid transition, private cloud is the right answer, because they can control the templates that go in, they can control the environment, they can control a lot of things, even the tooling there, but at the same time gain advantage of some of the moving fast with the software development process. So I see a lot of large scale, actually most of the Fortune 500 customers that I deal with are actually in there, right? They use public cloud on the side for some new age cloud native application development, but a lot of development is happening there, and they're just trying to add more efficiency to their traditional data center by giving it a more of a private cloud flavor.
Got it. So let me just make a point of debate here, right? Which is, if you break down the $10 billion of AWS revenue, obviously only they would know exactly what it is, but let me just tell you Sunil's view of the financial analysis there, which is about 3 to 4 billion is their top 50 customers. Apple pays them $1 billion, Netflix pays them $500 million, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's probably another couple of billion of startups, and there's a whole bunch of companies that we know of. But one of the interesting enterprise workloads that's exploding on Amazon right now is the analytics workloads, right? The map-reduced jobs and the classic, IT pharma companies, they want to run their test apps, and they can run their 1,000 machines, crunch it, and then stop, and then for the rest of the 14 hours, they don't have to consume that compute capacity. So I would like to get some further clarification from the statement that you said about data-intensive workloads, and maybe it's, IT pharmaceutical test trial applications actually also run their core IP, right, to some extent, and maybe they don't. But what's your sense of how you would answer that question?
Great question, Sunil. So from my perspective, it's not that no data intensive or centric application runs on public cloud, right? It's really, if you combine that with the security view, and then say huge data sets that don't necessarily need to go through stringent security requirements, like CPNI, PII, PCI. In fact, we do that too from a T-Mobile perspective. We leverage public clouds like AWS or Azure to, as an example, we have huge data sets that require quarterly reports, half-yearly reports, or annual reports from insights and analytics perspective. Classic use case, instead of trying to spin off a 100-node Hadoop cluster or maybe 100-node infrastructure for analytics needs, can we just have the infrastructure, move the data, be done with your analytics, and then shut down the environment, and then you have your result. But when you associate the security aspects of do we need to protect the data? Do we need to have various controls established as part of the processing? That's where the challenges start in terms of going to public cloud. Rahul, do you have other thoughts there?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And you also hear of like big studios running on Amazon. You hear about every time you go to an Amazon conference, you will hear like, everything runs there. In my mind, it just depends on a few questions for the customer. Number one is, where is data generated? If the data is generated in a web front end, it's a no-brainer, you just crunch it there, right? The second is it an ephemeral kind of a thing? Is it like you want to do it for a while and then you want to spin it up and do a lot of crunching and then scale it back? Then also public cloud makes sense. But for ongoing analytics, number one. Number two, when people see this as a competitive differentiator for their core business, and when a lot of data is being generated by their current applications, then trying to move that data in on an ongoing basis, right? Remember, if for a trial, you can take everything, put it in the public cloud and have multiple agencies look at it. In that case, it makes sense. But when you're trying to generate a lot of data, move it there, do some analytics, move it back to take an action, in those environments, it just does not make sense. You better, especially if you have the tools now. Also, the thing is the tools were not available that much, right? So the services that were available in the public cloud were, in my mind, a little ahead of what was available on the private side. So people have to make the hard decision. Now I see on the private side, the tools are maturing as well. So now the options are more like what makes sense to you versus you go to public or private. It just depends on what you're trying to do with it.
Got it. I've been told to, at least start wrapping things up to move things around. But one other, obviously, off-script question, because pretty much other than my first question, everything is off-script. But so far, it looks like it's going okay, so let's risk one more. So one question that also shows up, which is a second-order question, but potentially more strategic, is, fine, we'll use an Amazon-like architecture inside the enterprise, re-platform our data center, so we get all the right benefits of Amazon, but from a right cost and control perspective, right? Plain and simple. Why are private clouds here to stay? But obviously, that assumes one thing, which is a lot of my applications are not going to be re-architected. Because that's one of the comfort factors of using an Amazon-like architecture on-premise, right? But we all know that with the world of SaaS and with the world of applications delivered as a service over the next 10 years, 15 years, many of these applications will get re-architected and will get delivered as a SaaS app. And in doing so, not just infrastructure, but applications are delivered more and more as a service. So therefore, why would there ever be a private cloud? Maybe it is a 5 to 10 year project. Who wants to take a first cut? 5 seconds. Yeah, sorry.
So from a re-architecture of applications and then the relevancy of private cloud perspective, I don't necessarily see that as a big issue, Sunil. So what I mean by that is when you look at, from an app development perspective, any application, web, mobile, data, and when you look at the infrastructure that is needed to run these apps, a bunch of web servers or a bunch of database servers are middle layer, web service layers, maybe API that is hosted on these servers, right? And when you talk about re-architecting those components, that is going to be primarily will be part of the app design. Do we need to keep cloud infrastructure in mind? It really kind of goes back to, honestly, how decouple architecture that we are building. As soon as we take care of those decoupling aspects in your architecture, I don't think there will be any dependency on, okay, is this relevant for AWS, is it relevant for Azure, or is it relevant for my private cloud? As long as your app architect or whoever is the dev lead, make sure that they are architecting the solution in a decoupled way, it should run anywhere. Now, that anywhere obviously will make us make choices in terms of, okay, do we need to make a choice on public or private or hybrid or community clouds, right? But I don't necessarily believe that it involves heavy re-engineering or re-architecture if you take care of those things in the beginning stages of whatever the application that you're trying to run, either on a single server or on a 1,000-node cloud architecture, whether public or private.
Got it. Any one of you guys?
I can add. So I would classify application into two categories, like in terms of re-architecting. One is stateful application and one is stateless application, right? And most of the private cloud, you want to keep your data, sensitive data, within private cloud, right? And when you have state involved, all the stateful applications that make use of this data, you want to keep it in the private cloud, right? So even if you're re-architecting, because of the data locality and proximity of the data, right, you really want to have this data within the private cloud. And another point I would just like to mention, like VDI, I worked VDI 7 years, so I know, like, I can share some of the perspective, because latency sensitive really matters a lot, right? And when you are architecting this application like VDI, for example, where you are remoting your desktop over the remote data center, where latency is really critical to give that user experience, end user experience to your users in the enterprise, you really want to have VDI remain in the private cloud. So those are the 2 points I would highlight.
Got it. Okay. Any last comment?
Yeah, there's one thought which is counterintuitive, but let me bring it out. Customers also are concerned about getting locked in with their clouds because they're starting to use the services.
Just like locking to VMware. Is that what you tell me?
No. So
All right, keep going.
yeah.
Sorry.
So that's another aspect. Basically, you're looking at the applications we built such that it is abstracted enough that you're able to transport between different cloud itself, right? So if you build something which is started to use certain services, and then you want to really move it around, you can't do that. And that's another concern that is coming up.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys actually have tried to move 5 petabytes out of Amazon. Just try it. So anyway, with that, let's open it up for some questions. I don't know if you guys even have any questions, but yes. You want to go to the podium there, please? Thanks.
Hi. It's working? Yeah. Yeah, hi. So I'm Deep and I work with Cisco working on software security, and hence question is related to that. So I heard you that cost, performance, elasticity, all of these are very important. What I did not hear, and I see survey on the internet that many of the guys, CIO, etc., when they take decision, public versus cloud, security is the biggest concern, but it doesn't seem like going by the panel. Could you please elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, maybe let me just couch it a little bit, but have maybe Rahul speak to it. So a lot of the characteristics that were subliminally mentioned was compliance. Sai mentioned about T-Mobile. One of the reasons was the sensitivity of the data, that they wanted the IP and so forth. So it was subliminally mentioned. Part of the reason why, when you look at it, it's almost like the obvious reason, right? We were just trying to get to what happens when Amazon shows up at your doorstep and says, look, here's a great, compliant, highly reliable, highly secure cloud. What are the other factors beyond security that would make sense? Hopefully that gave you some idea.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Anything else? Yeah.
This question is related to the lock-in. So when customers bring their data into, assume that they are bringing the data into public cloud, and the integration happened, and there are cases, not all cases, that every time the public cloud, the data is accessible and well integrated. There are cases where there might be failures happening, right? So are there any cases like where you have experience bringing the data back into the on-premise? And how do we set up the SLA agreements in that case with the vendors?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'll let someone else chime in, but I have obviously a very strong viewpoint on this. Sai?
Well,
Yeah.
my answer is, Satish, great question. No, from a T-Mobile perspective.
Whoa, was this a scripted question by a friend, by the way? Yeah.
No.
Okay, yeah.
When you look at the rate card from our cloud partners in terms of ingress and egress details of how much they charge for data in, data out, we haven't really ventured yet in terms of taking massive amounts of data out of cloud. That's one of the reasons actually we don't put a lot of data there permanently. Going back to Sunil's comments on try how much it's going to cost taking 5 petabytes of data from AWS. TCO matters a lot. But your question though, from a pricing perspective, we knew it is going to be very costly. We haven't really had an experience so far where we kept hundreds of terabytes of or petabytes of data there, and then we tried to bring on-premise.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the point is, very specifically, there is an API called CBT, Change Block Tracking, right? For any practitioner a data application, you have to use that to actually understand all your application data backup protection, so that you know that you can go back to the right version of the application, right? Pretty much every enterprise app has that. Ask Amazon, once you have that application, can you expose that API so that you can actually extract that data back, right? So there's some fundamental reasons why that's not accessible. So in general, the timing of this private versus public is relevant simply because it's not about public versus private, it's about, frankly, I have 10 workloads, which workload makes sense to go where? And when you go somewhere, you should thoughtfully do that, because there's a good chance that when you go somewhere, you might stay there for a long time. So I think that's the current evolution on the public cloud side. Now, at some point, I'm sure they'll open up their APIs, they'll make it a lot more homogeneous and so forth. So, anything else? Yes, please.
Hi, so 3 options to build your private cloud. So do you use your own tools like Chef, etc., or you go to third party like VMware, Juniper, or kind of use the OpenStack to start building your own cloud? So these are the 3 options. So from a long-term perspective, what would you recommend?
That's like a panel in itself. I don't know, I'll open it up for you guys. Yeah.
I think it's just matters on the ecosystem. I think OpenStack is, proliferating in some, like there is a lot of ecosystem being played. We saw there is another panel just before us, ZeroStack. Ajay presented some of the, like how you can, in a cost perspective, right? And also from the deployment perspective, how easy it is to deploy private cloud with a very least effort. So I think it just boils down to like the rich ecosystem that comes with the tools and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, the comment back was how much customization is required and all that, yeah.
Yeah, I can add to that. But I think it just is a very simple, so what is the quality of your IT and the quality of your applications and their needs? If you have a very sophisticated IT developer types who can write a bunch of scripts and whatnot, go build your own. Because that way you can control everything you want. Somebody like Facebook, you can do it. But then the next best is, you can, if OpenStack has matured to a level, it was really much beyond where it was, but still it needs some sophistication. You just can't put an OpenStack cloud out of the box. So if you're willing to take that hit, still want the control, no lock-in, choose whatever you want, manage your costs, OpenStack is the way to go. But if you're like, IT is my business, I'm not in the business of IT, I want to put it quick, I think every hypervisor vendor and open source have their own stack. Pick the one that you like and go with it.
Yeah, I think the only subtle thing, I mean, it's right on, I think, is just make sure, though, that the architectural criteria is very similar to how Amazon has built it. Because that's the only way the cost argument works, right? Because if you build it using the old model, then the cost argument goes away of a private cloud, which is the reason, frankly, you're seeing companies like, the company not known as Pepsi going from a cloud first to a cloud only model. Is because they just couldn't re-platform their data center in time so that their cost argument went away, right? So just keep that in the back of your mind, independent of the approach that you use. To Rahul's point, you have to be honest that it looks, breathes, feels, operates like an Amazon. Okay, I think we are done, right, Tushar? Are we good? Thanks, guys. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.